Welcome everyone to Women in the Military podcast. I'm really excited to have Rachel here. She was on the podcast and I should have looked and saw what number, but it was a while ago. It was like a year ago, I think, for
Yeah.
when we're recording, November of 2022. So I'm really excited to have here. That was an episode focused on like what it means to be a veteran, and so now we get to hear her story. So I'll link to that episode in the show notes so that people can go and find it easily, especially since I don't know what number it is off the top of my head. But welcome to the show, Rachel. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me back. I'm excited to be here again.
So let's start with, why did you decide to join the military?
So my story with deciding to join the military is kind of two layered. So I initially joined the military out of desperation of a situation in 2012 because I was in a toxic relationship, only one working. I was working 2 to 3 jobs at a time and supporting someone else. And so the military was like a way out for me of like, oh, it's going to give me insurance. It's going to support, this other person that I am basically taking care of. It's going to help me get out of all these problems, right? Well, not that simple because E1 pay is nothing. And so I ended up deciding that it wasn't for me and dropping out of the delayed entry program at that time, with the caveat of being told you'll never be able to join the Navy again. Well, obviously there is waivers for everything. And so when the recruiter reached back out to me 2 years later and was like, hey, we are for this very short period of time allowing people to join the military, I said, okay, I'll do it. And at that time, it was more just like I had just gotten out of that toxic relationship. I was ready for something different. And it was just kind of I guess another outlet for me. So I guess kind of the same both times, but different circumstances. When I decided the second time to join, I decided to do it more for me. And so really just kind of a way to get out of the Midwest. I lived in Iowa, and to do something that would push me. I was going for a rescue swimmer position in the Navy, and I didn't end up making it, but just something that pushed me and was for me was really my like motivating factor to join that second time around.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you'll bring up something that like recruiters will tell you, like, you'll never have the opportunity to do that again, but that's rarely 100% true. I mean, there are rules and there are waivers required, but there are waivers and that can get you around different things. So if someone told you like you can't do this again, you can look into it and see if there's a way to make it happen. Um so when so then you went to basic training, and what was that experience like?
So yeah, I went to basic training in Great Lakes, Illinois, where the Navy, well, it's like the only location for the Navy now, I believe. And went there 2015, March 2015, March 10th. And, I really expected it to be the hardest experience of my life. Like I was going in expecting it to be incredibly hard. And I do this a lot with things in my life where I like overhype something in my head so much that the actual experience isn't that bad. But I would say that I was borderline disappointed when I finished basic training because I really expected it to be so much harder. What I found at the end of it was that because the military was in this kind of weird transition period where like a sapper had just became a thing a few years back. I mean, it's 2015, so it'd probably been a number of years, but people are still adjust. It takes the military a while to adjust to changes. So they were really weird about how they were treating females specifically. And at the very end, one of the chiefs, he wasn't my division chief, but he was very involved in my division the entire time I was there. He asked us females, was I too hard on you when I was around your division? Was I too easy on you? And I would say the general consensus in the room was that they were way too easy on us. And you could blatantly see, like, they would go over to the male division and IT them a bunch. And then the female division was like, oh, I just like pick out 1 or 2 people and maybe we'll make them just do like a lean rest, like up push-up position for a little bit. And then like, that's it. I never really saw anyone hit that like mental brink where like they are really pushing themselves physically. And I would say the same with like really everything in boot camp, right? Like marching, there are people that I could have sworn they were going to get held back because they could not march to save their life. Nope, we pushed them through. There are people who could not fold laundry, which is like a huge part of Navy boot camp. to save their life, still pushed them through. People who blatantly like I had a rack mate who quite literally took all her clothes and like threw them in her bunk and like didn't fold a single thing. And you know, kind of twofold to this. I mean, they had people come help her fold, but at the same time, like she was blatantly like in multiple areas disregarding the rules, and they still pushed her through. And so I think that there was just a lot of hand holding that I didn't expect, and a lot of like, oh, we're gonna help you graduate because it just pushes you on to the next area. And I expected more like molding of people to happen, if that makes sense.
And did you feel like your male counterparts had a different experience? Because, I mean, if they're talking to you at the end saying, "Were we too hard?" and you're like, "I just wanna be treated like the guys, right? I just wanna be
Yes.
treated the same."
Yeah, so it's funny because a lot of the guys would purposely try to get in trouble so that they could be like IT'd more, right? Because they were already IT'd, quite a bit. And so, yes, I did see a blatant difference in the way that we were treated between the male and the female divisions. And obviously, I wasn't over in their compartment, so I didn't like physically see what they were doing over there. But obviously, when we were there, the doors across the hallway were open, so you could see when they were over there. But it felt like even when we were integrated together and like doing things together, it just felt like the attitude towards the males was a lot different than the females. And I really think it's because the RDCs felt like they were almost walking on eggshells, and not all of them were this way. I had some really incredible RDCs when I was in boot camp, but you could definitely see that there were people who felt like, oh, I'm walking on eggshells because I don't want to be accused of something in an instructor position.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes it really hard too because I think you're expecting something to be a certain way, and then not only is it not the way you expect, then you can also see that it's like you're being treated differently, which is like the exact opposite of the point of like what women wanted. They wanted to just be treated like, you know, like Navy sailors. It wasn't like they wanted their gender to matter in that sense. And so I could see how that would be really challenging.
Yeah, yeah. And the other side to it too is that in Navy boot camp, and it's gotten worse now. It's not this isolated thing anymore like it used to be. Like it's not this isolated surprise of you don't know what you're getting into. I mean, there's a whole YouTube series on Navy boot camp now. And so people know what they're getting into. I found out the other day recently the Navy's now allowing cell phone usage, limited cell phone usage during boot camp, which a lot of people have really positive opinions about that. I think for me personally, I didn't like that my RDCs would let people in the middle of boot camp go to the next and get like candy and snacks as like a reward for like, oh, you guys did really good and you passed these tests and you got all these flags. We're gonna go get like Sour Patch Kids from the next. It's like, no, no, no. This is supposed to be an 8-week experience where I am going through something difficult, not like a snacks and movie hangout time period. It was just very quote unquote modernized in a way that I think for me I didn't appreciate that. I wanted it to be a little more, I guess old school would be the word. And there's ways I think to make it old school without the toxic part of old school, like the beatings that were like physically harming people and stuff, like there's principles that we can take and leave and still keep the military. And I thought that there was just um a lot of things that were integrated that I think don't really serve the positive purpose of boot camp.
Yeah, one of the things I mean, I have, like, mixed feelings about the cell phones because, like, I understand it's, like, a great way to connect with your friends and family and, like, to get that support, and, letter writing isn't very common anymore, but then it's like one of the reasons that you didn't have like, I didn't have a cell phone. My cell phone didn't do anything exciting. It was just a phone because I'm old and it was 2000, I think, 4 when I went through my boot camp training. And so they took our phones and we couldn't use them the entire time. But we were also like isolated from like everything going on in the world around us, and like if you have a cell phone, which is basically a computer, and you have free time and you can go on the internet and you can talk to people and you can like every weekend like you can get that, it really kind of diminishes like some of the like community and connection that you have with the rest of your unit. And I feel like there needs to be like some sort of balance because like whenever we got free time at it was never free time. We would go to church because if we went to church, then they couldn't talk to us and we like couldn't have like some made up thing that they made us do. And whenever people didn't go to church, they would tell us like, "Oh, I want to stay back because I want to get caught," and they would never get to do it because it was never free time. But now they get like legit free time on their cell phone and get to go on social media. And I'm like, that's just like so crazy because we had a 4 hour block of free time and it was never actually free time. There was always stuff that they were like, oh, you need to do this, you need to clean this. And yeah, so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
understand.
Yeah, Sunday free time, we were folding clothes, we were ironing the folded clothes. I was, taking my hour-long shower that I was only allotted on Sundays if I chose to take that option. But yeah, I agree with you in the fact that social media, from a mental standpoint, can trigger a lot of things in our brains, and we really lose focus when we have a cell phone there. And it's not just about the talk communication piece, because that piece has been provided. There's payphones at boot camp. We got those, I don't know, 2-3 times the entire time that I was in boot camp, and that's fine. It sucks when people don't answer, but it's just kind of part of boot camp, I guess. Yeah, I would say that yes, I understand people need to talk to people and in that connection, but I think I'm pretty firm on, I don't think that boot camp is the place for cell phones, because there's so much more to a cell phone than a phone conversation these days.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. Yeah, I don't get to make those decisions, but I totally agree. When someone
Yeah.
told me that, I was like, what? I
Yeah.
was like, "That changes everything," and it's not that long, like, it's, 6, 8 weeks, it's not like a year without a phone, it's like a short period of time, and, like, once you graduate basic and you're at AIT, like, I know you, like, earn but, like, your phone should be, like, an immediate thing that you get once you graduate, and I
Yeah.
think yeah,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
So
exciting to get your phone back. It's like,
right.
finally. Yeah. Yeah.
I know
Agreed.
they gave it to us the night before and they were like, "Do not turn it on. You cannot use this. We're just making it so it's, like, logistically easier." And
Yeah.
so none of us turned on our phone. But it also, like, was obvious because the only thing you could use it for was to call people, which
Yeah.
is funny they were, like, so strict about it because we were done with our training, we just had
Yeah.
to leave the next day.
Or play
But
Snake on your Nokia phone.
yeah, you know exactly what I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
So so you went to basic, and then where was your first assignment? Or did you guys don't call it AIT, what does the Navy call it?
A school is what it's called, and mine
A
was in
school.
Pensacola, Florida. So I went immediately there from Great Lakes. Thankfully, I did not have to get held back in Great Lakes like some people do. And I was supposed to only be there for, let's see, I got there in June, I think. So I got September. I think I was only supposed to be there for like 3 months. I ended up being there longer because I got in trouble when I was in A school and I had to do 30 days of restriction. So they had to adjust my orders to my next duty station. But yeah, the pipeline is like, there's a oh, I don't know if I remember the names of everything now. There is like I think it's called AT or something, where it's like just like a basics, you learn how to use like screwdrivers and tools. I don't remember anything that I learned. And then there was, for me, because I was avionics, there's I strand and then there's O strand, so intermediate organizational. I was an I strand AT, and so my schooling was longer than the O strand ATs because mine was a little more technical and like, more into the details of stuff. But um yeah, trash training. I didn't learn a single thing in A school.
But then where did you go after you finished your training?
I went to Whidbey Island, which is where I am still at today. Not in the military anymore, but NAS Whidbey Island, small base in the north part of the state of Washington, and it's just a naval air station, so no boats, anything like that. Never stepped on a boat my entire time in the Navy. Started shore duty, which is kind of unheard of, I guess, for someone just starting out in the military. Usually you start at sea duty because it's the crappier version, but shore duty for a year and a half. Then I actually left my shore command a little early because my sea command needed people so bad that instead of me transferring in November, they picked me up in June.
Yeah. I did know that most of the people that I've talked to who are in the Navy, their first assignment is sea duty because it is a little bit harder. You're deploying, you're on a pretty high ops tempo, and then shore duty is kind of like the gift they give you so that you don't have to be deploying all the time. And so I have heard that. And so you were at Whidbey Island. I was also proud of myself that I knew that was in Washington. I was like, woo woo. I'm learning things. Then I couldn't then I, like, totally blanked on A school, but it keeps me humble. But,
Oh, good.
so were you doing avionics when you were at Whidbey Island?
I was, yeah. So I started out at FRC Northwest, Fleet Readiness Center Northwest, and I was working on a component of the Growler aircraft, and it was like nothing I'd ever done before as a civilian because I joined the Navy. I wasn't right out of high school, obviously. I worked a little bit before I joined the Navy as a civilian, and so when I walked in this area, FRC Northwest, especially in the area that I worked in, it was a secret area. So there's a code to get in the room and there's no windows. And so it was just kind of, it was a different environment. And I worked on these benches and I mean, I don't know how to describe them other than like these tall metal um, rectangle is probably the biggest way to describe it, and they're pretty long. And you connect this to this component, which was called a UEU or Universal Exciter Upgrade, which is the brain of the Growler. And the Growlers are the aircraft that do the signal jamming. So whenever a fleet of F-18s or whatever, I don't know all my terminology, go out on a carrier, they'll always have a Growler with them because it can jam the signals on the ground. And so I think NASWE is the only place that actually has the Growlers out of all the naval air stations or Navy bases as its home base. And so I worked on the UAUs. It was really boring. We would just hook up this component to this UEU and it would test for 8 hours plus. And if anything tested wrong and we had to break continuity, like pull out any component, we had to start the test over. Um, the weirdest part about that command for me is that I never really felt like I learned anything there because everyone was just on autopilot. No one was reading the book and using the what's called pub to do any maintenance. They're all just kind of like, oh, hey, come here. This is how we do this job. This is the corrosion inspection. Well, when I finally dug into the book later, because I'm like, well, in A school we learned how to use pubs, kind of. Like I didn't fully understand it, but I knew they existed and I didn't fully know how to read it. And I started reading this pub, and it turns out that it was like 5 versions in the past because so much had changed operationally that we couldn't even use the pub because it was wrong at this point. And so they'd always be like, oh, QA is going to come in, make sure you have the pub open. I'm like, well, no wonder why it doesn't make sense. It's outdated because no one uses it and no one realized that it needed updated. So that was my eye level. O level, I actually got the chance to work at VQ1 on the EP3 aircraft, and I really enjoyed O level because you get to actually work on the full aircraft, not just like a tiny component of the aircraft. So I level, you pull the component out, you work on the component. O level, you get to work on the full aircraft, and it was really cool.
That does sound really cool. That sounds like yeah, it was funny, you were like, "My job was so boring," and I was like, "Really?" And then you're like and I was like, "Yep, that sounds pretty boring." And then you got to switch and do something that was a little bit more exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing about O level too is that there's more to the job. Like it's let's say I level is like a 9 to 5, right? Like my first year there, they were sending us home at like noon, like half the group home at like noon every day because there's nothing to do. So boring, but there were some perks to it. We got 2 hour lunches because there was like nothing to do. Looking back now, if I was to join the Navy now, I would have utilized that time to expand my mind and like learn other things and make myself more valuable. But first command, I didn't know. I was just doing what I was told. But no, on O level, you get to learn how to launch and recover the aircraft. You wash the planes. You have opportunities to work alongside more people because it's not just the group in a locked room that no one else can enter without the proper clearance. It's kind of everyone working together. And so you kind of get to see the full picture a lot better than the intermediate level, which some people love too, but not for me.
Yeah. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. So you got like two totally different experiences, but at one assignment.
I did, yeah. And, Whidbey Island likes to, well, they're notorious for keeping ATs in the area here. I know some people that have been on this base for 12 years and they just kind of bounce from command to command. And I think it's because from a monetary perspective, it's just cheaper to keep people in the same area, but also it's very specialized things up here. So like the growlers, for example, if they're not at any other place, any other like naval air station, when people get that NEC or that specialty training and code, then like this is kind of it. This is where you stay unless you go shore duty somewhere else to do something else. But yeah, people get stuck here.
So how long did you stay in the Navy? Because you said that was your only assignment, right? And you're still there now.
Yep, 6.5 years. I got out in 2021. So 2015, end of 2015 is when I made it up here to Whidbey Island. And then September 2021 is when I separated from the Navy.
And then I have to ask, why did you decide to leave the Navy? As you're wrangling a your little girl.
Yeah, my daughter. So I thought back and forth probably my first few years about, okay, am I going to do 4 years? Am I going to do 20 years? Am I going to do 2 tours? I mean, I think a lot of people that I talked to that were active were always like, oh, just stay in. Just, if you don't like this command, you got to try another command. And I think it creates this like toxic mindset of like, oh, this one's bad, but the next one won't be bad. And then, oh, well, what if the next one? And I remember having a conversation with myself of, okay, why would I just try to continually chase the next thing, not knowing whether or not the next thing is good or bad, when I don't really fully enjoy what it is that I do? Like, it'd be different if I was like, oh my gosh, I love being an AT. This is the best job I've ever worked in my life. I could do this for 20 years, but I really didn't love being an AT. And when I picked the AT job, it was literally just because I was trying to be an air rescue swimmer. I needed a job in the aviation field. Well, I didn't need one, but it opened up aviation field jobs for me when I chose to be an air rescue swimmer, because MEPS decided to do a depth perception test on me that they apparently forgot the first time I went to MEPS. So no aviation jobs were open, but we just picked the job that had the furthest ship out date, and it happened to be avionics. And so I kind of went into that job as it was with this mindset of, I'll try it out, I'll see how I like it, and then, we'll go from there. But I really didn't love it. Good skills to have. It was cool. There were certain things that were really cool, like building connectors. I didn't mind doing. But I didn't love what I did. And then the other part to it too was that toxic leadership. Was that, when I went on my first detachment to Bahrain, seeing how the leadership operated was really disappointing to me. When I went to Bahrain for, I want to say it was 4 months, the first detachment that I went on. And it was me and I think one or two other females there on that detachment. And just seeing the way that there was one man in particular in my group that was very derogatory towards this girl that was working at the gate. They'd have reservists, usually Army reservists, that would stand gate guard in Bahrain. And he would just make like really derogatory comments about her every time we would roll up to the gate. And I would ask him politely, like, hey, can you not talk like that, please? Like, it makes me uncomfortable. It's disrespectful. And it was passed off by all of the leadership because I talked to my chain of command in the order that one should talk to a chain of command. And the excuse was, oh, that's just how he is. It's okay. That's just how he is. And the leadership on that detachment wasn't actually bad. Like, my chiefs were pretty good. They were good about the work schedule, making sure that everything was fair, talking to us and communicating with us. But that one situation really put like a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth. And then it seemed to get worse and worse with the other detachments that I went on. When I was in Japan, I had my LPO, leading petty officer, would get really, really drunk, and he would run off into the woods next to our barracks hotel that we were staying at with a full bottle of whatever it was that he was drinking. And then we wouldn't know where he was until the next morning. And everyone's excuse was, oh, he always ends up back in his bed the next morning, so it's fine. And I'm like, no. And I already had an ARI on my record anyway. So had I got even wrong place, wrong time, even if I was doing nothing wrong, I would have got kicked out of the Navy. And so, just seeing how leadership was a huge red flag for me, because it wasn't that the leadership was just bad. It's that when I was vocal and I brought up that, hey, this leadership is not doing what leaders should be doing, it's that it was dismissed as okay. And I had a problem with that. And so it was probably realistically after my first detachment that I made that decision of, okay, I want to get out. Unfortunately, it was too late for me to get out at my 4-year mark at that point, because the Navy created a instruction that said you're going to match your EAOS to your PRD or vice versa. And so I could have either gotten out at my normal 4-year mark, because I signed a 4-year contract, or extended to my rotation date. And because I had that weird start with shore duty and then go to sea duty rotation, my two dates did not match up. They were 2.5 years off. And so my circumstances at the time that I decided to extend is that I was applying to be part of the nurse corps and I wanted to go officer. And so I was told, if you decide to get out at 4 years, it's going to look really bad and you probably won't get picked up for officer. And so in the whole 3 days that I had to decide something that was going to affect the next 2.5 years of my life, I decided at that point to extend 2.5 years. But it was not too long after that I was like, no, I don't want to be a part of this organization anymore. And so ultimately a culmination of a couple things: not enjoying what I did, toxic leadership, and then I think realistically, all in all, just knowing that my mental health was more important than being a part of an organization that I really didn't feel like cared much for me.
Yeah, and that's a real challenge I think that the military as a whole is having, and especially with younger generations, like having like really high expectations that when things are brought up through the chain of command, that's just what we've been taught to do, and then nothing's done, that feels like betrayal and leads to not having trust. And then mental health, it's so important, and it's something that people are talking about now, something that people didn't talk about just 20 years ago. And so that makes a lot of sense, like with all the different factors of what's going on around you and just not feeling like you were getting the support that you needed. And so you're like, why would I continue to sacrifice myself if you're not going to take care of me?
Right, right. And understand too that even up until the last year that I was in the Navy, there was always the thought in the back of my head of, should I just stay in? Because I got pregnant my last year in the Navy. I could have done a maternity tour. I could have just, gone back to my command and done the last little bit of my sea work, because I was limb due my last year, for mental health, not pregnancy. But and I could have gone back, finished my sea duty, and then done a, quote unquote easy shore duty for 3 years. Like, I could have extended my time, but I think for me it was like, well, what's the purpose? Like, what is the purpose of doing 9.5 years in the military? Like, does it really serve me? For me personally, no. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So, what was your transition out of the military like? You stayed in the local area. Did you find a job, or what are you doing today? How was that transition?
So I got out of the military with plans to go to nursing school. And I had actually, because I mentioned I was in LIMDU already, I had actually already started nursing school. I got my associates while I was active using the tuition assistance. Went into the military with some college credits already. So just kind of finished that up so that I could get into the nurse corps mainly. Didn't get picked up for nurse corps, obviously, but I decided to continue nursing school while LIMDU was gracious enough to let me start my first quarter of nursing school while I was still active duty, which is really unheard of because I was full time in school. Thankfully, because of COVID, most of my classes were virtual. So I didn't have to physically drive to Seattle, which is 2 hours away from Whidbey Island, by the way, without traffic. I didn't have to physically do that until the end of my quarter, or once a week for one lab class that I did. And so it worked out really well. And I was set up to get out of the Navy one day and then the next day start quarter two of nursing school. Well, getting pregnant was not in my plans. So that threw things off for me quite a bit. And then COVID also threw things off for me quite a bit. And so just kind of weighing my options, I ended up deciding that I was going to drop out of nursing school because I just didn't really see how this would fit in my life and work well, especially being a mom. And knowing that being a mom, I wanted to be very much like involved and present in my daughter's life, and knowing that nursing school wouldn't allow me to do that because it is so like intensive with the classes and clinicals and studying and all that stuff, especially in the beginning part of school. Also being in Seattle, so taking time away driving down. And so ended up deciding to not do that anymore. And so realistically, my transition was pretty rough because it went from like, yes, I know what I'm going to do, to all of a sudden, like, not only did my plans change, but like now there's another human being that's going to be relying on me. So it's not like I can just go get a job. September, I separated from the military. I had my daughter in January. So it was like second trimester, bam, third trimester, bam, baby. And so I did get on unemployment for that little bit of time, which gave me a bit of a cushion. Got my service connected disability finally a few months later. They wanted to do x-rays and stuff, which they couldn't do while I was pregnant. So I ended up having to wait for a lot of that, but ended up finally getting that figured out. And then I would say that for me, the transition period was just a lot of like figuring myself out, because to this day I still haven't worked a 9 to 5 job, and I'm okay with that. I mean, every once in a while I'm like, I should just go get a job because it'd be easier. But the podcast, I started my podcast, Your Story Doesn't End Here, 2 months after I separated from the military. So that for me was very healing, but also just a hobby and something to do. And then also just going the entrepreneurial path, which for me has been a lot of like learning and failures and figuring out exactly what it is that I want to do, which I would say like I'm finally at the part where I'm like fine tuning what it is that I want to do, but I've changed my mind so many times and trialed and errored so many things. And so it's a lot different path than I think a lot of people go down. And I'm actually just now 2 years out of the military starting to learn the transition pieces that would have been helpful for me then, but I didn't have that full support then, especially separating during COVID, because like TAPS during COVID was an online course. It was not an in-person, you sit here and attend a course for a week and meet people and whatever. I couldn't even tell you what TAPS entails because I clicked through it just to get it done. I didn't actually pay attention to anything. And so yeah, the transition period was really rough, and I didn't expect it to be that way because I thought I was just going to go back to um the person I was before the military, which I'm not that person anymore, and I wasn't mentally prepared for that. So yeah, it's been different for sure.
Yeah, I think it is really hard to have your plans disrupted and like having all the things that change, but then also like I feel like the only people you really can talk to about what it's like to transition when you're in the military are people who are in the military who haven't transitioned, and then you aren't really like there's a disconnect between like the veteran and like the things that people tell you that's important are important things like getting your disability claim done and like making sure you have like all these things that are important things to have done, but then there's like the emotional aspect and people don't really talk about that because they haven't experienced it and they only are like going through the checklist. And add in the fact that it was COVID and you're not even getting to go through TAPS. And we had people like, we had someone come back and talk about how he was gonna get a government job, but then he ended up getting a job at a private firm and like shared that experience. And even though I was pregnant and was about to have a baby and wasn't planning on working, that conversation really stuck with me because it was so impactful of him sharing his story. And so like I think TAPS had a lot of things lacking, but then there were also some good things. And at the time, I didn't realize like how important it was to talk to veterans, and I still see that today. I went to a conference with a bunch of women who were serving, and they were so like focused on the mission and what was happening in front of them. And I'm like there with like all my knowledge and resources, and nobody asked me questions about, and I was like, I understand because that's the way I would have been in the military. So it's like, how do we get people to realize like there's people who transition and it's not going to be like you said, just going back because your life has changed and you're not the same person.
Yeah, I actually just did a podcast episode on this, and obviously this isn't this when this episode that we're on right now is going to be a few months out. When now
Right.
it's end of November, but talking about how like when I was in the military, I was just thinking about like here now. Like I wasn't thinking about what's the next step. And I just had a conversation with someone a few days ago and asked this individual like, hey, like what's your plan? What's your next step? And that mindset in the military is just like, what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do next? I just need to survive right now. It's like everyone's in survival mode. And so no one's thinking about 4, 6, 20 years down the road when they separate because it's inevitable. Transition does happen, whether it's in 4 years or 20 or 30 years, but it's just not a conversation that's had enough. And I think it does a huge disservice to the veteran community because I think that if we would focus more on the transition and reintegration process, that we could be proactive to a lot of the mental health issues that we see on the veteran side.
For sure. Yeah, I'll have to link to that in the show notes so that people can find it. Because that sounds like a great episode and so important because I agree we need to get talking about transition because it is inevitable and then like sometimes it happens, med boards happen, life events happen, and you never really know what's gonna happen. And the more that you're preparing, like that's one of the big points of my book, Girl's Guide to Military Service, was I wanted to create it because I wanted people to have a strong foundation and to start thinking about the future and why they're joining the military and what they want to get out of it so that when they get out, they can use that. And so many people, we're just focused on like the here and now and we're not thinking about the future and we're thinking, oh, I'll just do this job. It doesn't really matter. But if you actually think, like, what do I want to do when I'm done with the military, that can help give you a better answer of what to do in the military because there's more opportunities and like if you're thinking about it that way, I think you can get more out of it. But you can also
Absolutely.
just do something really cool and fun that's totally different. But if you're thinking about the future while you're making those decisions, I feel like you make better decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And understanding too that some people's jobs aren't like it's not always just the job translating to the outside, right? Like there's other skills we build in the military too. And there's so many skills we build in the military. And a lot of people think very linear, like, oh, well, I'm working on an aircraft. So I'm gonna get out and I'm gonna work on an aircraft. Well, no, like what did you learn in the process of working on the aircraft? What leadership skills did you build? What critical thinking skills? When I was going through my quarter of nursing school, I realized that my ability to pick up on things very quickly and comprehend them far surpassed anyone else in my cohort. Like I could literally get a list, like a page long list one day and have it memorized the next day to successfully pass an exam. And I was like mind blown with myself. But because in the military, you have to learn things very quickly. You have to take a book that is incredibly thick. And here you go. You got a board on this in 3 months. Good luck. And not only do you need to have the information memorized, but you need to know how to apply it. Like there's so many skills that the military teaches us outside of just that tangible physical job. And so I think that's another conversation that the military should be having is like figuring out what skills people have that can be applied to really anything they want to do with their life.
So true. Very true. Yeah, there's so much that you gain from the military that you can use in so many different ways. And like, yeah, when I was at TAP, they were like, well, you're an engineer, so you have to be an engineer, and you're this, and you have to be this. And it's like, no, actually, you can do anything you want, and you can just build on what those skills are. Like, my background is in civil engineering, but I'm a podcaster and a writer, but I use a lot of the stuff I learned from the military in like creating structures and creating plans and workflows. And that's all like engineering and military related. And it helps me to be more efficient in the work that I do now. And a lot of people are like, those two don't fit, but it works for me. And it's just, it's helped me find my passion and the discipline. And like, there's so many things from the military that I use today that that aren't really job related. They're
Yeah.
things the military taught me.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah. So, is there anything else from either your time in the military or your transition out that you wanted to talk about before I ask my last question?
Um, I think just that in the military, I learned a lot about myself as a person, and I learned a lot about other people around me. But I didn't start to really put the pieces together until I was almost out. And so, one thing that I would say I would encourage people to do, and this kind of goes in line with what we just talked about, is to just think outside the box more, and push yourself more to not only expand your mind but understand other people around you better, because it's not only going to make you a better person, but it'll make you a better leader. And when I talk about the reasons why I got out, which is the reasons why a lot of other people get out of the military, which goes back to leadership and mental health, I push so hard for changing the culture, because you can bring all kinds of instructions down the chain from the top down. You can change rules, regulations, put policies out there, but none of that matters if we're not actually changing the culture. And so, the one point that I would really, really like to stress to anyone listening to this episode is, how can you be a part of that positive culture change? And sometimes that requires thinking outside of the box and not just looking at the immediate issue or problem in front of you. And sometimes that requires you to be uncomfortable or to expand your own mind and to just learn more about how to be a human being, because we don't have a manual that teaches us how to be humans. We just kind of have to figure it out as we go, and that's okay. But I think it's so important to actively work towards that positive culture change in the military and veteran communities, because people get out. Some of them are still toxic, not all of them, but some of them are. But yeah, just always working on being better. And if you're listening to this podcast, then it's already a step, because you're learning something about different people. Just listening to stories of people is a way to expand your mind. So I applaud you for just listening to this podcast. But that's my little plug for your podcast and my advice to
And
anyone who's listening.
your podcast as well.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thinking about what you were talking about culture, I recently finished Military Culture Shift by Corey Weathers, and she was on the podcast earlier this year in January. And so, I really think her book, it's, like, changed my mind because now, or my way I look at interviews, because now I'm, like, looking at generations and thinking and, like, hearing your story and thinking about, like, what Corey wrote about. It's like, obviously, these things, like, really affected you because of, like, you know, your age and what you experienced and how the military was, and so many of the challenges that the military is facing is around culture and the way that the military is perceived by the generations that are, joining right now, and all the way that social media has changed the information. And so it's really interesting. That book is really, really fascinating, really interesting, and something that I think hopefully military leaders are reading, because I think it'll be eye opening to them, and hopefully, veterans and people in the military, because it's just it's really interesting to look at. I'm, like, reading the book saying, like, "This is what happened to me," but I didn't even realize, like, what was going on because I was just living through it. And, yeah, as the book continues, you get farther in history and you learn, or closer to current day, and it's just fascinating to see, so that
I have
ties
not
in.
heard of that book, so I'll have to go check it out because it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it was just released in November. We're doing this interview in November. I know it's being released in March. I'm a planner, just a little bit. So yeah, so it was just released in November, and it's and Corey has done amazing things for the military community. So it's exciting to see her write another book. And yeah, so I always like to end the podcast with, what advice would you give to a young woman who's considering the military? So what would you say?
Yeah, so for all the young women that are considering the military, I would say just do your research, which is a really generic response. So I'm going to explain what I mean by do your research. And I'm going to use my story as an example, because when I joined the military, I just kind of went into it like, oh, well, this is an option. I'm going into it blindly. And I was kind of setting expectations as I went. When I was in boot camp, I created this expectation based off of that environment that the military was going to be this safe place where everyone was polite, greeted each other, because that's what the boot camp environment was. It's supposed to be that way, right? which created a huge culture shock when I went to my A school and realized that that's not how the military environment is. And so, by reading books like Amanda's book or talking to people who have lived the experience, and not just getting the positive side, get the positive side, yes, but also understand the negative sides of what happened to people in the military. Why? Not to create a negative mindset towards the military, because there are wonderful things in the military, but because when you set an expectation of anything and everything that could potentially happen based off of other people's experiences, then you are more prepared and you can be more focused on what you want. So I would say do your research, but then also make sure that you are always doing what works best for you. Don't ever get veered off in that path of, well, oh, the recruiter wants me to do this, or my command wants me to do this. Well, what do you want? And when you do the research and you know your stuff, then you can confidently make these decisions to be able to live a life that works best for you. And so I think that alone would make a difference in a lot of women's lives, joining the military and in the military.
I think that's such great advice because, yeah, you can easily lose your track of you and do what someone else wants you to do, especially as women. We find that is like we want to do what the person around us wants us to do. And so you have to think, like, what do I want to do? What works best for me? What are my priorities? And not let, anyone else influence that.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being a guest. I'm really glad we got to do this interview, and I'm just so excited that it worked out. And so thank you so much.
Thank you for having me again, Amanda.